something very important has emerged from a new interview with three of Nolan Wells' closest friends, and it centers on a question that has followed this case from the beginning. What actually happened during the hours surrounding Nolan's death? The young men have now spoken at length about what they say happened after Nolan was found dead, the accusations that followed them, the threats they say they received, and most importantly, the timeline they believe has been misunderstood by the public. One detail from the interview stands out immediately. According to their attorney, Morgan, Jax, and Warren had already left Horn Island at about 4:30 in the afternoon on July 4. Yet, the attorney says, two members of the Ocean Springs community later reported seeing Nolan alive at approximately 10 minutes before 6 p.m. If that account is accurate, it places Nolan alive roughly an hour and a half after the three friends say they had already left the island. That is a detail worth slowing down for, because timelines can matter enormously in an investigation. But before we get to that, there is another part of this story that helps explain why these young men decided to speak publicly again. Before Nolan's death, they described their lives as ordinary college lives. They spent time together, went places together, and, according to their own accounts, Nolan was someone they considered a brother. After his death, they said their lives changed dramatically. One of the friends described the feeling as though his life had hit a hole. He said everything seemed to stop, and the group was simply trying to take life one day at a time. Another said they became afraid to go out in public because they worried that somebody might recognize them, confront them, or possibly try to hurt them. That fear, they said, did not stay online. During the interview, the friends described what they characterized as death threats and confrontations in public. One particularly disturbing incident allegedly happened at a restaurant. According to the account given in the interview, one of the friends was approached by a woman who first asked whether his face looked familiar. She later returned with a recording of an earlier interview on her phone and asked him whether the person in the interview was actually him. He confirmed that it was. The group then decided to leave. The friends said the situation became more uncomfortable outside the restaurant, where people who were with them allegedly received threats. One person they encountered reportedly warned them to leave before somebody got hurt. Those are serious allegations, and the interview does not independently establish every detail of those encounters. But the experiences help explain why the friends say they have become increasingly reluctant to speak publicly. They also say the public attention has been difficult because they are still grieving Nolan. And that is where the story becomes even more complicated. Their attorney, Ed Parwick, who described himself as a defamation attorney representing the young men, said during the interview that he became involved because he believed the men had been unfairly accused. He made a particularly strong statement about their involvement in Nolan's death. He said he was completely confident that Morgan, Jax, and Warren had done nothing wrong. At the same time, he made another statement that is important to separate from that conclusion. He acknowledged that he did not know how Nolan Wells died. In other words, the attorney's position was not that he had solved Nolan's death. His argument was that the three young men he represents were not responsible. That distinction matters. The interview repeatedly returned to the idea that the public should separate what is known from what people believe happened. The friends themselves also discussed how quickly different stories began circulating after Nolan disappeared and was later found dead. One of them said he wished Nolan's death had never happened and wished his friend could still be alive. But he also criticized what he believed was an early rush to create a narrative around the case. He specifically discussed social media posts and photographs that he said helped push attention toward the group. According to his account, the men felt that people began drawing conclusions before all the facts were known. They also strongly rejected what they described as a racial narrative surrounding Nolan's death. One of the friends said Nolan was like a brother to them, and argued that the public portrayal of their relationship did not reflect how they actually knew him. Again, those are statements from the friends, not an independent finding about every claim surrounding the case. But then the interview moved away from emotions and accusations and towards something much more concrete. The timeline. Their attorney said he had personally gone to Horn Island with Warren and Jax. He described the island as a long, narrow barrier island with low sand dunes and very little tree cover in the area under discussion. He also said that thousands of people were present on July 4th. That physical description became important to his argument. His position was that the geography of the island, the number of people present, and the reported timeline did not fit the version of events that some people had been discussing online. And then came the detail that may deserve the closest attention. According to the attorney, Morgan, Warren, and Jax left the island at approximately 4:30 p.m. He then said 2 respected members of the Ocean Springs community reported seeing Nolan at around 5:50 p.m. If those accounts are accurate and can be corroborated, that would place Nolan alive well after the 3 friends had already departed. The attorney said the 2 witnesses had known Nolan for years, and that their accounts could potentially be supported by other eyewitness information. But there is an important caution here. The interview provides the attorney's description of those witnesses and their accounts. It does not give us the witnesses' names or independently establish the complete evidence behind the sightings. So the question becomes very specific. What can ultimately confirm the timeline? And what happened during those roughly 90 minutes between the friends leaving the island and the reported sighting of Nolan? That is where this new interview begins to raise questions that go beyond the accusations and the online arguments. Because if the timeline holds up, it could change how people understand one of the most important parts of the Nolan Wells investigation. That timeline becomes even more important when you look at what the friends say happened immediately after Nolan was no longer with them. According to their account, they did not simply disappear from the situation and wait to see what happened. One of the friends said he contacted the Coast Guard and that he was also the first person in the group to contact Christine Wells that night to tell her they had not heard from Nolan. That detail matters because it places the friends' own account of their actions very early in the response to Nolan's disappearance. But there is another side to the story that cannot be ignored. The friends said that, from the beginning, people online were already discussing theories about what had happened. They described seeing claims that they had taken Nolan to the island, left him there, or were somehow responsible for what happened to him. They strongly denied those accusations. One of them said that the early stories contained claims that were not supported by facts. He also expressed frustration that the story had spread nationally before, in his view, the available information had been properly established. For the friends, this was not simply an argument happening on the internet. They said the accusations followed them into their real lives. One of them described being recognized in public. Another talked about friends being confronted at stores and questioned about Nolan. They said members of their families were also affected by the threats and attention. And according to the interview, this became one of the reasons they eventually sought legal representation. Their attorney said that if people had made false statements about the young men, and those statements caused harm, there could be potential defamation claims. He also said he wanted people who had made accusations to retract them before finding themselves in court. But the attorney was careful about one point that deserves attention. He said the case was not about proving who killed Nolan. He said the men he represented were innocent of wrongdoing, while acknowledging that the larger question of how Nolan died remained unanswered. That distinction is important because it prevents 2 separate questions from being treated as though they are the same. Question 1 is whether these particular friends were responsible. Question 2 is what actually happened to Nolan Wells. The interview offered a strong defense of the friends on the first question, but it did not solve the second. And that brings us back to the timeline. The attorney's account says the three friends left Horn Island at approximately 4:30 p.m. Then, according to what he described as eyewitness testimony, Nolan was seen at approximately 5:50 p.m. That creates a gap of about an hour and 20 minutes. It is not proof by itself of what happened during that period. But it is a significant period of time because the location and timing could potentially help investigators determine who was where and when. The attorney also emphasized the physical characteristics of Horn Island. He said there was little vegetation and limited tree cover in the area being discussed. He described it as exposed and narrow, with large numbers of people present on July 4th. That description was used to challenge theories about what could have happened there in broad daylight without being noticed. But once again, that is the attorney's interpretation of the location. The interview itself does not establish that every possible scenario has been ruled out. The physical setting is one piece of the puzzle, the timeline is another, and eyewitness accounts are another. The strength of the overall picture depends on whether those pieces can be independently corroborated. There was also another issue raised during the interview that could become important: an audio recording connected to the case. Near the end of the interview, the discussion turned to a phone call and to claims that some people had enhanced the audio and manually created a transcript. The interviewer questioned whether that transcript had actually been produced through an automated system or whether it had been manually constructed. That is a significant distinction. An audio recording can sometimes be difficult to understand because of background noise, poor recording quality, distance from the speaker, or other interference. Enhancing an audio recording can make certain sounds easier to hear, but interpretation can also become complicated if people begin treating an edited or manually transcribed version as though it were the original recording itself. The interview did not provide enough information to independently determine the authenticity or accuracy of every version of that audio. What it did establish is that the recording has become another point of disagreement. And that brings us to one of the most frustrating aspects of the Nolan Wells story. There are several different layers of information circulating at the same time. There are statements from Nolan's friends. There are statements from their attorney. There are claims made online. There are reported eyewitness accounts. There is the physical geography of Horn Island. There is an audio recording that has been debated. And there is the central fact that Nolan Wells died. The challenge is determining which pieces can actually be verified. For viewers following the case, that may be more important than any single dramatic accusation, because a compelling theory can spread in minutes. A timeline takes longer. A witness account has to be checked. An audio recording has to be examined in its original form. And physical evidence has to be interpreted in context. The friends say they believe the public reached conclusions about them far too quickly. They also say they believe Nolan's death became surrounded by narratives that did not accurately describe their friendship with him. One of them described Nolan as his brother and talked about routinely picking him up because Nolan did not drive. Those memories reveal something that can easily disappear when a case becomes a viral story. Before Nolan became the subject of national attention, he was somebody these young men knew personally. They remember ordinary things: driving to meet him, picking him up, spending time together, going out. Then one day, those ordinary routines became part of an investigation into his death. And now, months or weeks later, depending on where the investigation stands, every detail of those relationships is being examined through the lens of what happened afterward. But there is still one question that the interview did not answer. If Nolan was reportedly seen alive around 5:50 p.m., What happened after that sighting? And just as importantly, can that sighting be independently confirmed through additional witnesses, records, communications, or other evidence? That is where the investigation becomes much more than a debate between competing stories. Because if the timeline can be established with reliable evidence, it could help narrow down the period investigators need to understand. And if another piece of evidence contradicts that timeline, then that contradiction would need to be examined just as carefully. The friends have given their version. Their attorney has made his position clear. But Nolan Wells' death remains the central unanswered question. And there is still another part of the story that deserves a closer look. What happened after the friends made those first calls? And how did the story surrounding Nolan's disappearance develop so quickly? The interview ultimately brings us back to the same question that has remained at the center of the Nolan Wells case. What can actually be established about the hours before and after Nolan was last seen? The friends have been very clear about their position. They say they did not harm Nolan, and their attorney went even further, stating that he was completely confident they had nothing to do with Nolan's death. At the same time, the attorney acknowledged something equally important. He does not know how Nolan died. That distinction should remain at the center of this story. The interview does not provide a final explanation for Nolan's death. What it does provide is a detailed account from 3 people who say they were close to him, along with their attorney's interpretation of the timeline and the circumstances surrounding the accusations against them. One of the strongest points raised was the reported timing of the group's departure from Horn Island. According to the attorney, Morgan, Warren, and Jax left at approximately 4:30 p.m. He then described 2 members of the Ocean Springs community who reportedly saw Nolan at around 5:50 p.m. If those accounts are confirmed, they would place Nolan alive after the 3 friends had already left the island. That does not, by itself, tell us what happened to Nolan afterward, but it does establish why the timeline has become such an important part of the discussion. The location itself also matters. The attorney said he personally visited Horn Island with Warren and Jax. He described the section of the island being discussed as narrow, exposed, and largely without trees or substantial foliage. He also said thousands of people were present there on July 4th. His argument was that the physical environment and the number of people present should be considered when evaluating theories about what could have happened on the island. Whether that argument ultimately holds up would require examination of the full evidence, including witness statements, available records, and whatever investigators have established independently. The interview also raised questions about an audio recording. The interviewer said some people had enhanced the audio and created a transcript manually. He questioned whether that transcript came from an automated system and whether it could be considered reliable. That issue remains unresolved within the material we have, and that is important. An audio recording should be evaluated from the original source and with appropriate technical analysis, rather than relying solely on versions circulating online. The same principle applies to the timeline. A reported sighting is important, but investigators would still need to establish who saw Nolan, exactly where they saw him, what time the encounter occurred, and whether other evidence supports the account. Those are the kinds of details that can turn a disputed story into a verifiable timeline. The friends also described the personal cost of becoming publicly associated with Nolan's death. They said they received threats online and described situations in which they felt uncomfortable or unsafe in public. One friend recalled being confronted at a restaurant after someone recognized him from an earlier interview. Another described hearing about a friend being confronted at Walmart. These accounts help explain why the young men said they wanted to stay out of the public eye. They were grieving Nolan while also dealing with accusations that they said had changed their lives. And there is an emotional detail that appeared repeatedly throughout the interview. The friends did not describe Nolan simply as someone they happened to know. They described him as a brother. One friend remembered repeatedly picking Nolan up because he did not drive. Another spoke about how painful it was to think that a decision made on a particular day could somehow have changed everything. Those memories are important because they show the relationship before the investigation became the dominant part of their lives. But the interview also showed how quickly personal grief can become entangled with public speculation when a case receives widespread attention. The friends criticized what they believed was an early rush to create a narrative about Nolan's death. They argued that people should have allowed local officials to do their work and release information before conclusions were drawn. Whether every criticism they made is justified is something that must be evaluated separately. What is clear from the interview is that they believe the public story moved faster than the verified evidence. Their attorney made a similar argument from a legal perspective. He said his concern was not simply that people were discussing the case. His concern was that, in his view, false claims had caused harm to the young men he represents. That is why the interview eventually moved toward defamation. But defamation claims themselves do not answer the mystery surrounding Nolan's death. They address a different question: whether statements made about the friends were false and legally actionable. The investigation into Nolan's death remains separate, and that is perhaps the most important takeaway from the entire interview. There are questions that appear to have answers. The friends have provided their account of what they did. Their attorney has explained his position. There is a reported timeline involving their departure from Horn Island and a later sighting of Nolan. There are allegations about public confrontations and online threats. There is an audio recording that has been disputed, but there are also major questions that remain open. What happened to Nolan after the reported 5:50 p.m. sighting? Can that sighting be independently corroborated? What other evidence can establish where Nolan was during the critical period? And what will investigators ultimately determine about the circumstances of his death? The interview does not answer those questions. It does, however, make one thing very clear. The people who were closest to Nolan want their version of events heard, and they believe important parts of the public narrative about them have been wrong. For viewers who have followed this case from the beginning, that may be the most significant reason to pay attention to the evidence rather than simply the loudest theory. A viral claim can travel across the country in a matter of hours. A reliable timeline takes much more work. A witness account has to be checked. An audio recording has to be examined. A location has to be understood. And ultimately, the circumstances surrounding Nolan Wells's death have to be established through evidence. Until that happens, there are still unanswered questions. So now, I want to hear what you think. Based only on the information discussed in this interview, how important do you believe the reported timeline is? Particularly the claim that the friends left Horn Island around 4:30 p.m., while Nolan was reportedly seen around 5:50 p.m. And what do you think investigators should examine most closely next? The reported eyewitness accounts, the timeline, the audio recording, or something else? If you have been following the Nolan Wells investigation, share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. And if you want to continue following developments in this case and other investigations, where the evidence matters more than speculation, make sure you subscribe to the channel. The biggest question remains unanswered. What happened to Nolan Wells after the last confirmed pieces of the timeline begin to separate?